So today I just wanted to talk about augmenting GStack for higher quality output. And so before I jump in, I want you guys to be thinking of some like crazy, wild startup ideas because we'll use those later for like a demo. So a year ago, 2 years ago, the big push or like the big hype train with AI was seeing, oh, can you one shot something? Or oh, can you see how fast you can do to like create an app with AI. And you could like AI could do that really fast, but it was never like super high quality content. And so I wanted to kind of focus a little bit more, and the market's kind of focused a little bit more of how can we still move fast with AI, but kind of maintain quality. Um, and so I kind of wanted to focus on that part too. But before I jump into that, just a little bit of background about myself. So I was born in Texas, raised in California, Silicon Valley, California. So this is the Apple spaceship, their circular campus. And where I grew up is actually at this house right here. And so my parents actually still live there. And so it was kind of really cool being in kind of the tech scene growing up. In December of 2022, graduated from BYU in computer science, and I minored in entrepreneurship. You'll all remember I did not work at ChatGPT, but you'll remember that ChatGPT came out in November. So I was like, graduated right as AI was starting to get big. Started right after out of college at Ben Labs with Jacob. And then at some point during that time, also worked on a little side startup with a friend named Harry called Joltly. And then went out to lunch with Jacob. By this time, he had already moved to School AI, and he mentioned how cool School AI was, and they were hiring. And he convinced me to reach out to Wes and see about getting on board. And it was actually kind of cool because, if I remember correctly, like the hiring phase or at that time had the hiring round had like finished, and so I was like, okay, that no worries. And then it was like a week passed, and then Wes was like, hey, someone canceled. Can you come in tomorrow? And I was like, I'm there. And it was awesome. It was great. I've loved working at School AI. I I don't know if you can find a group of like more talented, down to earth, friendly engineers, and everyone's super mission driven about making like the experience better for teachers, for students, and it's been awesome. And I also got married to my beautiful babe who's right here. And that was obviously the best experience of my life. So that's a little bit about me. So the plan for tonight, I want to talk a little bit about the lay of the land, just kind of give us some context to frame how we look at GStack. And then I kind of want to look at GStack under the hood. I didn't want to make it just the surface level, oh, here's how you install it, here's how you use it. We will talk about how to use it, but I wanted to go a little bit deeper, talk about how to augment it with superpowers, and it's going to be awesome. So here's kind of what it looks like when you're working with an LLM. So on this right-hand side, it's kind of all the stuff that we don't have a ton of control with. So you think of like Anthropic, where they're training Opus, and they have their in-weight safety alignment training, and then they have their external safety, making sure as you're using it, you're not doing crazy stuff with it. And then on the left-hand side is kind of all the stuff that we kind of have more control over. So you can look at like the prompt, and then all of the other stuff that is passed in that context window, and then something that's kind of been a little bit more in the new or like talked around is something called the harness. So like having the harness engineering. So when you think about prompt engineering, I was actually originally going to come and tell you guys that you don't need to worry about prompt engineering anymore with like Fable coming out. But while I was researching for this talk, I found this article by Anthropic about how to prompt Fable. So I figured it's probably still a little bit relevant. But prompt engineering is all the strategies that you can do within the text that you send to the LLM. So you can give it a persona, pretend that you're a senior coding person, and then do this problem. Or you can give it like concrete examples of here's what the output looks like, and then also giving it concrete anti-examples can be a really good too. I've even seen some people say just sending it the same, literally verbatim message a second time. And just because it has the context from running in the same message the first time, it does better the second time. And so that's kind of how prompt engineering looks. Context engineering takes it like the next step further. So you've probably used an AI and then you're in the groove, you're doing really good, you're getting in there, and like an hour passes, hour and a half, and then you start to notice like you haven't done anything different, but you start to notice that it's really doing dumb decisions. And that's what this graph kind of shows, is that once you get to around 60% context window, you really start to go down in quality. And so being able to optimize the context is like super important to be able to maintain quality. So some of the things that you can do for the context is like telling it to store the state, telling it to store the like the current plan that it's working on in documents in your repo, so that and you can easily spin up another session afterwards to continue right where your current session left off. So another strategy is storing documents throughout your code base, so that if you have like a service area, you could have a service markdown document that it reads if it's looking at that area. And that way it only looks at the context for how to do service stuff in your app when it's at the service layer. And then I've heard that even better than storing documents like that in your repo is to actually use skills. And so you can use a skill which essentially just puts the title and then the like description of what that skill does into the context. And then if it needs to know about front end stuff, for example, it can just read the front end skill and get all that in. And so that can be handy if you have a couple of areas like a monorepo where you have front end stuff scattered around your code base, then it can just pull that and you don't need to actually worry about having that same document in different spots on your code base. One of the things that I've really started doing is, so there's like the clear command, which obviously you can do to just clear your context if you're starting something new. And I've found using the rewind command can be really handy, so that if I'm in the groove and I'm getting close to my context limit and I'm working on a bunch of tasks that are related, but they're not like independent on each other, then I'll rewind the conversation so I'm still in that context that's really good and fresh, but then I can keep working on like additional tasks. So that's like the context window. And then finally we have the harness window, or the harness engineering. And so the harness, the way I think about it is there's kind of like the big harness and then there's the little harness. So the big harness is like whether you're using Claude Code or whether you're using open code. So for example, here's some stats from Terminal Bench. And so these are all using the same model, Opus 4.6. And this is based on their ranking on the right-hand side accuracy. I can't totally speak to how they compute that. But the point I want to make is that you can have the same model with Claude Code and it can get like 58%. But then you can have using Droid or any of these other ones, and you can get up to like 76%. And the model didn't change at all. It was all about the harness that you were running the model in. And so it can get better accuracy. And then I know that this isn't like super legit, but I found this post from someone who's done some experimenting, and he found that you can also get cost advantages by using different harnesses. So for example, using the same prompt on the same project, Claude Code took 75 cents, but then open code and then even Pi was down to 28 cents, all using the same model. So that's kind of like the big harness. And so sometimes if you're not getting the output quality that you'd like, you can consider changing the harness. Or if you're still getting decently good quality but you want to save money, you could consider changing a harness and then doing a cheaper model to get similar quality output. But then there's like the little harness. So the little harness is essentially all the things that you do inside your Claude code. So for example, the smallest example of this is like using a Ralph loop. Ralph loop, for those who aren't familiar, is essentially just a while loop of like X iterations, just keep doing this thing. And so that's like, in a sense, essentially a harness engineering where you're controlling what it does. You can take it even smarter though, and then you can essentially do a Ralph loop, but then you have it connected to an external source or an external way of like stopping it. So that could be like code coverage with like testing coverage. That could be like a lighthouse report for like the front end. It could be, I have an old coworker who connected up to like linear. And so he essentially said, Ralph loop, just do the next task on this linear project until you're done. And so that's how you can even make it even smarter. I've tested around with the Ralph loop, being able to use it essentially connected to an MPC or MCP server, which just has like a stack or like a queue of tasks. And so then I can just give it dynamic tasks and it'll just take the next one and keep working on it. But there's some other cool things that you can do with harness engineering. For example, you can have it dynamically choose which model to use depending on the task. So a common strategy that a lot of people like to use is using Opus, or once Claude comes out once Fable comes out, using Fable for like all the high level planning, and then using smaller agents like Opus or Sonnet to actually do individual build steps. And that's great for that context like we were talking about, where you can even use those sub-agents to help with the context. So that's kind of laying out the land of where we're talking. And one of the things that I think is interesting is, like, do we even need to worry about context engineering? Do we even need to worry about harness engineering when we have like big models like Fable, which will hopefully come out, in the future? And my argument is yes, we still need these for even big models. And I want to give a little bit of an analogy. So let's imagine you have your old car, trusty car, and you've learned all the safety and the guardrails that you need to be able to use it wisely and get quality outputs from it. And then you're like, okay, it's finally time for me to upgrade to my new car. And so you go to the dealership and you trade it in, and they give you, or they suggest for you, this guy, because they're like, we have this epic new car that you can use, and it's so powerful. And it's so powerful, you don't even need to use any of those safety guardrails or any of those things that you did before. And obviously, with a car example, right, it's like, oh, obviously, I need to use more safety with this massive piece of equipment than with my car. And I would argue kind of similarly with Fable, or with as we get bigger models, like having those guardrails are still going to be super pivotal and important. And you're going to notice as we talk about GStack, how it kind of touches the prompt engineering, it'll touch the context engineering, and it touches the harness engineering. So it kind of has its fingers in all of those different pies. So with that little preamble out of the way, let's actually look at GStack. So GStack was created by Garry Tan. He's the current CEO and president of YC, and it's had like a major, almost like a rocket ship reaction with people, and almost like a cult-like reaction with some people. Don't worry, these are all AI generated, but but there has been like some fanfare where you'll look at people's comments and how they respond to GStack, and they're like, whoa, this has changed the world. It's completely different from any other AI framework. And to a degree, I think that is true, mainly because of, at the core, it's based around the principles of Y Combinator, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. The San Francisco startup incubator, Paul Graham, get out of the building and talk to the people and see what they want. And so at the very heart of GStack are these principles of Y Combinator. And I think this is what makes it different from other frameworks and other, essentially SDD frameworks out there. I'm gonna get a water break. But you might be thinking, okay, if I don't want to do a startup, I don't want to be an entrepreneur, is this even worth my time? And I think it still is, because the cool thing about GStack is that it doesn't essentially be a yes man and tell you, oh, your idea is super good. There was that story of this guy who was using ChatGPT, and the messages, there was like hundreds of messages in this chat. and that essentially the ChatGPT had essentially gaslit this guy into thinking that he'd solved this massive, groundbreaking math problem, and he didn't. But but essentially, you'll never get that with ChatGPT because ChatGPT or sorry, GStack, because GStack kind of takes the opposite approach. GStack's going to push back and it's going to say, is this actually a good idea? Is this something worth building? And whenever I've used it, usually I'll go in with an idea and then it will usually tell me to pull back and say, what's the minimum wedge that we can do to actually like validate this idea before you spend any time building it. And that's all from these Y Combinator ideas. So just a quick install, super easy. It's essentially cloning Garry Tan's Git repo and then just running the setup script in it. There's a more detailed install on the repo if you want to actually like have like tailor Claude so that Claude will actually like pull GStack commands as you're working. Or you can just add it like this and not have to have the auto. You can just implement or choose when you want to do GStack commands. So let's talk about the bread and butter of GStack. And I wanted to focus on not just how to use it, because honestly, how to use it's pretty easy. You just type /office hours, and then it kind of walks you through it. So I wanted to dive a little bit deeper and talk about how office hours works, specifically how it makes you squirm and how it kind of puts you in the hot seat and makes you really think, is this something that I want to build? And I think that's valuable for people who have used office hours before, but I think it's also valuable for as you guys are like working on your own skills, or if you fork GStack and you want to make your own thing out of it, I think it's valuable to understand how it works under the hood. So one of my favorite quotes about GStack, so let me back up a little bit. So office hours is special because essentially it's what they do at YC. So they'll meet with, like for 30-minute meetings, they'll meet with Garry Tan or they'll meet with leadership at YC with each of the startups, and they'll give them hard, cold facts about how their business is doing and whether they need to pivot or whether they need to change how they're looking at things. And a cool quote that I found online is that this guy, Long Nguyen, he argues that essentially using office hours is better than if you had Garry Tan walking through the door right now. And he's making this argument because with GStack, with the office hours plugin, it will actually do research into your market real time as you're talking to it. It'll actually look at all, like whatever your market is, it can do research and have that context understanding of what it is. Garry, he probably doesn't have context in like automotive or health or whatever else you might be wanting to do an idea in. The other thing too is that Garry only has 5 minutes. Maybe he has to run to another meeting. And so it's so powerful being able to have an AI right here, right now, can take as long as you need to be able to walk through these steps. And so it can be really powerful. So let's dive in and talk about how office hours works. So office hours essentially looks at 6 core questions. It looks at the demand reality, like who would be upset if this vanished tomorrow? The status quo, what are people using right now to solve the pain? Desperate specificity, name the actual human who needs this thing. Narrowest wedge, what's the smallest thing you can do? This is like even smaller than the MVP. Like what's the smallest thing within the smallest thing that you can do to validate this as quickly as possible? Observation and surprise. And then in 3 years, is this still even going to be relevant? But I think the thing that's interesting with office hours is that it's not just a checklist going through these things. It actually smartly looks at these and it decides based on where you're at, which ones you need to apply. So for example, the first question it asks is something along the lines of, are you working on a startup or are you working on like building mode? And then if you say you're working in startup mode, then it's going to ask where you're at. Are you pre-product, has users, paying customers, or are you a pure infra? And then based on that, it will actually deterministically choose which areas you need to focus in on. So for example, if your pre-product is mainly going to focus on these first three and not really talk about these last three as much. And then like exactly the opposite if you already have some paying customers. And so it's pretty cool where kind of like how we were talking about the harness and where the harness can kind of direct you based on where you're at. It's doing this totally in the office hours. So let's talk about some of the three things that it does to help. Because like even just going through the first three, you could still give it all, like it could still be a yes man just saying, oh, that's a great idea. So let's talk about some of the strategies that Garry did to really ensure that it's not just saying yes to everything you're doing, it's actually pushing back on you and against you and forcing you to really verify and validate that your idea is good. And so the three strategies that it uses are push until, red flags, and sub drilling. I shouldn't say the three strategies because I'm sure there's a bunch of strategies, but these are the three that I want to focus on. So push until, essentially, it's going to keep pushing until it hears like a specific phrase or it hears the right phrasing about around that area that it's asking you about. And that works perfectly with red flags because as you're like squirming and trying to answer, oh yes, there is demand for this thing, if you say any of these red flags that it's already coded for, then that's going to enter a new state where it's going to really dive in and harp on you for that red flag and really figure out if that's something that's like critical. And I think it's worth reminding that it's not like Garry was like, oh, I'm going to go and type out all these things that I think are important for validating startups. I like this is stuff that he's learned after years of being at YC and meeting with hundreds of startups. And these are all like the core principles that he's learned as he's been going through that. And then the third thing is even after you get through, you know, you say the right things of what it's looking for, and then you avoid all those red flags. Most of the questions also have sub drilling even below that so that you're not out of the hot seat yet. And so because it's doing all these things, it really makes you think and it really finds those hot points. It really finds those critical edges and it validates and de-risks those early, which is valuable because it can save you a bunch of time going down the road, building a potential app idea that doesn't actually have any legs. So just for the curious, so just for the curious, here's all the push and tills for each area. So for example, for the status quo, it's going to keep pushing until it finds like a legit workflow in hours or dollars that you've mentioned that you've been able to find as you've been talking to people. And here's all the red flags for those who are curious. And yeah, for this, like, for example, for the status quo, if nothing exists, or if they say nothing exists, that means they clearly did not do enough research in that market, or or it means it's not a need. Like if it was a need, someone would have already started an app or a startup around that thing. So that's why it's a red flag. So without further ado, let's look at a demo. So I hope you guys had your startup ideas ready. And I want to hear, and if someone wants to volunteer at their startup idea, we're going to actually try out office hours and see what office hours says. And we'll just look at how it responds for a couple minutes. All right. So does anyone want to volunteer an idea? If not, I also have some that I can put. But I want to hear one of your ideas first. Raking your garden? Oh, okay. Yeah, let's do it. All right. So yeah, like I was saying, it's pretty easy to use. You just use While it's going, if anyone has questions or if anyone wants to, yeah, the default like install shell script that GStack kind of ships with out of the box installs it at the top level. And you can like take those manual skills and put it in like a per project, but it's a little bit more work slash a little bit more sketchy because yeah, I guess that's the other side of it. It'll work for all of your projects. All right, so it'll ask us this. So it'll ask us, are we doing a startup, doing an internal company project, hackathon? We're gonna say startup. All right. It asks for a couple sentences, but didn't go crazy. So here's the cue. Question one, demand reality, right? So we looked at all the different areas. Right now we're in the demand reality space. And so it's like, what's the strongest evidence that we have? What do you guys, what should we say for our garden Airbnb app? What is our strong evidence that someone wants this thing? Oof. Feel true and mean nothing. First real thing you've said. See, look at this. It's already done market research. And it's so it's essentially pulling that in and saying they either stayed tiny or they died. But it looks like that was enough demand because now it looks like it's bringing us on to status quo. So anyway, so that kind of gives you, we don't need to go all the way through it, but that kind of gives you an idea of like, it doesn't pull any, it pulls punches. And it'll tell you what it thinks. And sometimes it can be a little heartbreaking when you go and you put in your idea and it's like, this idea sucks. Or for most of mine, it'll be like, this isn't like, the legality is going to be really difficult with this one. So probably don't. And I'm like, oh, it's probably right. But I was a little bit sad. But it's cool. And so I think that's part of what's made it so popular, the office hours one. I'm going to go a little bit in depth with Plan CEO review, but not nearly as depth as the office hours one. But first, kind of getting us into the flow of where all this sits. So office hours kind of decides what to build and how to attack, and then Plan CEO review kind of decides how big should we go and if this is the right thing to do, or like how to make it right. And then these two are kind of in this triad, the engineer and then also the design review help to make it bulletproof after we've decided that this is something that we want to do. One of the things that I didn't actually see this anywhere listed, but one of the ways that I've kind of thought about office hours and then plan CEO review is that office hours is all about outside the building. So if you're familiar with Paul Graham, you got to get outside the building and talk to people and figure out if people want this. That's what office hours does. It's all about the validating. The plan CEO review is all about inside the building. How are we going to make it right? How are we going to, let me even show. So these are like the 7 lenses that the CEO focuses on. and none of them have to do with validating. They're all about how do we make it correct, do it the right way, security, threat model, error rescue map, all these things inside as we're building it. So this is kind of where Plan CEO focuses. But before you jump in, or as you're jumping in to Plan CEO, it also has a couple modes, similar to how Office Hours has modes. So the Plan CEO has different amounts of how do we talk about scope. And so you can do scope expansion, where it's like, let's 10x this, let's do as much as we can with this. There's selective expansion, which is a little bit similar, but it's a little bit more tasteful. Hold scope doesn't expand scope or remove scope, it stays right on. And then scope reduction obviously kind of strips it to the core, and we only focus on the core things. And so you can tell it which mode you want to go into, but it also has defaults. So if you're building something new, it'll go for the expansion mode by default, for example. Or if you're doing a bug fix, it'll hold that scope just for that bug fix. So one of the things that I think is cool about Plan CEO Office Hours that I just want to focus in on for a minute is that it utilizes adversarial review out of the box. And so this is like a cool feature that I really like, and it prefers codex. So if you're coding with Claude Code, it'll say, let's take this plan that we've built, and I'm going to pass this whole plan over to codex. And codex is going to look and see what holes it can find in the plan. And this is better than not doing it, obviously, but it's also better than using Claude or even a Claude with zero context looking at the same plan, because different models are trained in different ways. And so different models can find holes that other models might not have. And so I think this is a really cool strategy that GStack has, and it's just incorporated as one of the steps for this one and in a couple of the other skills to really get that highest quality output and really try to be, I mean, it's difficult to say an AI is not biased because it's like essentially a summary or a average of all the biases, right? But it's really trying to get an unbiased opinion about the plan. So the other two passes, right? Engineering review, design review. Engineering review is obviously about how to build it and build it so it scales and it ships and it's secure. I love, this is like framing, this is like in the actual skill, they kind of frame it like this. Let's build it so it survives production. And then design is obviously about more on the design side. One of the things that's worth mentioning is that there's also a design shotgun skill, which will actually generate essentially 3 images with ChatGPT of different design styles. And then you can respond back about which one you like, which style you like the most. So some people really like being able to see that. Personally, with like Claude Design and even with like Figma MCP, you can do a lot. And then you can actually like select specific elements to edit. And so I actually like that more than the design shotgun. But it's worth mentioning that there's actually like a handful of design skills that come with GStack. Now, after you've gone through all of these things, right, it's not short. Garry claims the office hours takes 10 minutes. I don't think I've ever had a session of office hours be like shorter than 30 minutes. And that's when I'm like trying to just fake answers to it. And so going through all these can take for a long time. So that's why there's AutoPlan. And AutoPlan, essentially, it doesn't just generate the artifacts that those 3 would generate. It actually like spins up those 3 in parallel, and then it has an AI that acts on your behalf and responds to their questions. And so the AI in AutoPlan uses essentially these different steps to really try to do the best of giving the best answers based on your behalf, and then it will give you a summary at the end. So if you don't want to take a bunch of time, you can do the office hours so you can get like the main thinking in, and then you can do AutoPlan so you can kind of skip a lot of the additional back and forth conversations with it. So we've talked about a couple different skills. I think sometimes it can be difficult to know where to start. If you're greenfielding, this top one is essentially what we've what we've talked through. And DevX is essentially if it's like an API or an MCP server, only like that side facing. Or you can do office hours auto plan. If you're doing a feature and you have like clear knowledge of what that feature is and what it does, you can skip CEO review. But generally, Garry, in his own workflows, generally he goes for office hours every time. This is one thing that I didn't realize when I was first learning about GStack was that you actually use office hours for every main feature. I thought it was just for the greenfielding work. And then if you have like a little backlog issue or a bug, there's also a spec command that you can use. So on the other side of it, GStack's also looking at, okay, after the code's built, how can we ensure that it followed the plan that we were looking at? And so this is like our 4 main skills that look at that. Review, QA, ship, and land and deploy. So review and QA kind of work together, where review looks at the scope, it looks at what the plan was, and then it looks at what was built, and it says, did we stick to our plan and did we build it? And then QA actually uses like Playwright, and QA actually says, does it work? It'll actually open up Playwright and it will test it out and go through all the different paths and actually see if it works. Ship takes it from your code base up to the PR, and then land and deploy takes it from PR all the way out to production, and then it can even test it in production and make sure it landed correctly. One of the cool things I would just want to talk about with review is it has one of the steps that it will do is it will actually span out sub-agents which take different roles. So that's another thing that's kind of unique with GStack is that, like you saw, we have the CEO, we have office hours, which is your YC experience. There's like the engineer review, as though you're sitting in with your engineer, a designer review, as though you're with a designer. And so review uses those on the other side too. So review will spin up like a testing one. It'll spin up an agent to look at maintainability. It will spin up one to look at, are we maintaining API contracts if that was changed? There's a data migration one if we need to look at that. One of the things that's really cool is that it will also spin up a red team agent, which doesn't do any looking at the code per se, but it will actually look at the output of the other agents and see if those agents missed anything. So I thought that was really cool in the review one. So now let's look at, I guess this is the full workflow, including the QA and then ship, land, and deploy steps on the other side. But before we jump, kind of talking about some of the pros and cons generally of GStack, wanted to talk about a couple features which it kind of works under the hood. And so here, like GBrain, I was actually talking with Mason about GBrain earlier before we started. But then there's also like learnings, and it also like keeps track of decisions that you make. And so essentially all these things work together to make it smarter over time as you use GStack. So as it learns your taste, your like purpose behind decisions, it can actually be smarter and it won't bother you as much with asking you for particular decisions over time. Same with the learnings. It'll start learning patterns about how you like to work, and it will actually get smarter over time. So I think these are really cool, and they work kind of, you do have to do some initial setup, but after that, it essentially works under the hood, working all the time for your favor. And so that's another cool thing that I really like about GStack. So what do you guys think? Is GStack worth adding to your workflow? Obviously, there's a lot of really compelling, interesting things about GStack. The adversarial review kind of built in, the different angles that you can get from like office hours, and where it's not going to be a yes man just telling you that your idea is great. It's going to push back. It's going to make you think. But there's obviously some downsides. Like I mentioned, it can take a long time. You can have a long set of conversations before you hit actual writing code yet. One of the other downsides I alluded to was if you're putting your like your childhood app that you've always wanted to build, and then you tell it to GStack, GStack's probably going to rip it to shreds. And so it's not as good for like just fun personal apps. One of the other things is that it stores everything in a top level GStack folder. So you don't have any of the documentation or the plans in your actual repo. Sometimes that can be nice if you don't want to commit the plans to the repo, but sometimes that can be annoying too. But you may have mentioned, or you may have noticed that I kind of purposely overlooked or jumped past something. Something's missing in our GStack workflow. GStack kind of makes a big bet. GStack says, if we give you all the context, if we give the AI all the context and the intent and all the different paths that we want, we go through the engineering review, we go through the design review, and we get all of our plans perfect, or as close to perfect as we can, then we're just going to hand it off to the AI, and the AI is going to build it for us. And we're just going to trust the AI to do its thing. And then we'll verify on the other side of that bookend that it did what we told it to do. And sometimes it works. Sometimes it does do a good job of building based on the initial plans. But there's also a lot of critiques out there about GStack of it did not do a very good job of building, even though I had all the plans put together. This video specifically talks about that. He also mentions some of the skills could have been better as like CLI bash scripts instead of being like a skill that the AI had to run itself. So there's definitely some critiques about that middle section. But Superpowers has entered the chat. Superpowers is another AI development framework. It's actually pretty cool because it was added to the official Claude plugins in January. And so that's essentially Anthropic putting their blessing and their seal of approval on Superpowers. And it's all about how do we write code that is like test-driven development? How do we make it maintainable, make it really solid code whenever Claude is running? And it does a really good job. Just real quickly, here's the install. Even simpler install since it's been added to the Claude plugins official. And essentially, Superpowers goes through 6 major steps as it's doing development. The brainstorming step you can essentially think of as our original office hours, as our original engineer design CEO review. And so the brainstorming you don't really need to worry about as much, as you'll see in a minute as we tie it in. But one of the things that I really love about Superpowers is it essentially makes your Claude do sub agents by default. If it detects that it can use sub agents, it will. And so I love that. And I also love it does test driven development by default. And it's even enforced by Superpowers to write the test first, do red-green development. I even had one of my coworkers today, because I've been using Superpowers for a little bit, and I've really liked it. But he was like, "Do we want UI tests? Because it even does like enforced UI tests on the front end too, which can be you may or may not want UI tests. But that's just an example of like how disciplined it is in making Claude disciplined as it's writing code. But it's perfect because we can essentially take this Superpowers and we can plug it in the middle. And so we can put GStack on the front and the back, GStack helping us to build the right thing, and then Superpowers helping us to build it correctly in the code. And then GStack can come back and actually verify, do the same review and verify, and making sure that we did follow our plans. You'll notice I put it works almost perfectly. And so I'll talk about that in a second. But essentially, here's how a flow would look. So we talked about office hours. We talked about these 3 of our review triad, essentially. There's the one issue is that GStack doesn't store the files for those plans in the repo that you're working with. So in order to connect up Superpowers, you do have to kind of tell it where to find the project files so that it can pick up where you left off with GStack. I personally don't think you need to worry too much about the brainstorming step because you already did all that planning with GStack, but you could run it over the project just to see if there's any additional holes that it finds. But essentially, you can jump in to superpowers, start executing those plans, and then you can come back at the end with our review, QA, and those kind of bookend GStack skills on the other side. So you could do it. Honestly, it's not super hard. You can just point it at the GStack, the top level GStack folder, and then your projects folder, and then it will just automatically store the project name is just whatever your folder that you're working within. Your essentially your git folder of the project, your project's name in there. And then I actually built a little CLI. Uh, Maybe I'll post a link on to this afterwards. But essentially, this CLI looks at the project that you're working with. It'll look at your GStack projects folder, and it will actually smartly figure out which project is the one that you most likely want to use based on the name. It'll also look at which ones were most recently edited, and then it will just give that like working directory of that project plans file to Claude and instruct Claude to read it and use it. So essentially with the CLI, you can just tell Claude, hey, I want to do writing plans. I'm continuing from GStack, and it will just automatically know to call the CLI and look at the plans to pull from there. So let's do another little demo and actually look at how that works. So this is a test that I did previously. So GStack's all figured out, and you can even see like there's nothing in the folder. Like again, all the project files for GStack are in the main GStack directory. For those who are curious, I have an alias called Crazy Claude, which just essentially always puts dangerously accept all permissions into Claude. So that's whenever I do Crazy Claude, it just puts that in there automatically for me. So I can just write, hey, I'm continuing from GStack, and then it should just say, oh, nice. And then you saw it's running that discovery CLI, and then it should be able to just start with those plans. Um, nice. Yeah. So anyway, so it's able to just start working based on that GStack bundle. You saw the folder was empty before, and just called that, be able to get those markdown files from the previous GStack session and be able to just continue like normal. So yeah, so that's GStack. And there's a bunch of additional skills and things that you can totally dive into with GStack. I was talking with Mason. I learned some more about GBrain even before I gave this presentation today. And there's a lot that you can get excited about and learn about. There's a whole suite of iOS like Swift specific design review skills that they have, even just for like iOS development. So there's a lot of cool things. I think the main takeaway is that it does a lot of stuff that some of the other AI development frameworks do, but it does it with opinions, and it does it with the frameworks and the tried and true tested battle proved ideas from Y Combinator. And that can give you both an edge, and it can sometimes get in the way a little bit. But I think it can be really powerful when you use it and you can add it to your workflow. So yeah, any questions and hopefully answers maybe? I'm not personally using it at School AI. I've used, like you said, it's geared definitely more towards founders, towards technical co-founders, and I think you totally could use it for School AI, um, or like a bigger company. But I think it is geared more towards startups and solopreneurs. Yeah, yeah. I mean, a lot of it like could still apply, right? Um, Obviously, you'd want to like get the product. Sometimes I'll have like a lot of cool ideas, but then the product people are like, okay, slow down, let's not get too crazy. But yeah, there's definitely some skills that could definitely have application. Yeah, I personally haven't tried out the Teams features, but you're right. There are team features where they can have that. Essentially, you can have that shared knowledge base about your project that can be shared and added to from multiple different people, and it sounds really powerful. I have not personally used it, but yeah, thank you. Well, here is my LinkedIn. Always love to connect, and thank you for having me.